Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for tuning into today's webinar. I hope you've got your coffee or water or drink of choice and you're sat comfortably and looking forward to hearing a bit more about Compliant Database DevOps. First things first, a bit of housekeeping from our side. You will notice that you are muted for the duration of today's webinar. However, if you have any questions at any point, please do feel free to log these in the little question box on the GoToWebinar pop-up, and I'll be more than happy to tackle these at the end of today's session. You will also be sent a link to view this recording afterwards, so please no panicking if you miss even the tiniest shred of information today. So DevOps is one heck of a word nowadays. Generally, more and more people are adopting more than just the concept, but the mindset and the process to enable delivery of great value to end users, customers, stakeholders, anyone who benefits from the changes that you're making. There are, however, many aspects to a good, robust DevOps process, and there are, of course, a lot of spanners that can get stuck in the works, not least defining exactly what DevOps means for an organization. There's no one-size-fits-all DevOps, but there are some key principles we'll be walking through today, specifically relating to databases that hopefully will aid you in implementing the delivery of greater value for your customers, end users, stakeholders, anyone who may benefit. So my name is Chris Unwin. I'm a Redgate employee of about 3.5 years now. Don't know how they've managed to put up with me for so long, but I'm the data privacy specialist here. I write articles. I'm the infamous co-host of the Redgate DB Ale podcast, which is on iTunes and Spotify, Google Play, etc. So feel free to have a listen. And I'm going to be your host for today's webinar. So just a little bit about Redgate before we start. Who are we? Why are we coming to you through the magic of the internet and telling you about DevOps? Well, there's quite a few of us. There's about 314 of us, and we provide tooling for people primarily working with these databases. Now, we're very much a company who believes in practicing what we preach when it comes to DevOps. In fact, we had just shy of 1,300 product releases across our portfolio last year. And I'm not going to read this whole slide out to you. Obviously, that would be a bit death by PowerPoint. But the key is we support people in our communities. We like to see people being successful, certainly when it comes to adopting DevOps practices. So I want to start off by saying that in a recent article by Forbes about innovation, we saw that enterprises should be able to deliver custom applications at the speed of ideas. Not sure how you quantify that, but that's the way to stay ahead of the competition in today's world. And that's a pretty tall order. Lowering operational costs, enhancing customer experience is the core of digital transformation. Now, the C-suite and IT teams in any enterprise should work hand in hand to actually meet the business requirements, drive that innovation, and actually march towards continuous improvement. With innovation being a top 5 priority for almost every company included in the Deloitte Innovation Survey, it's actually no surprise that IT teams are adopting DevOps practices to help achieve the speed of innovation required for businesses to not only survive, but to thrive. So, what are the benefits of adopting a DevOps principle or practice? Well, Redgate had the pleasure of being involved in DORA's Accelerate State of DevOps Report 2018. Now, the research data shows that the highest performing organizations which adopt DevOps release changes 46 times more frequently. Now, not sure that anyone does anything that frequently. That's crazy speeds. I can't think of taking something I do even once a day and doing it 46 times, but that's the kind of speed we want to be dealing with. And that's the speed of innovation I mentioned. Now, they also have a change failure rate that is 7 times lower, which again is great because it means less chance of rolling back. It means that we're able to see success faster. And then, of course, the same practices lead to some of these companies being able to recover from breaking changes close to 2,600 times faster. 2,600. That is, yeah, incredible, mind-boggling. So the Forbes article I referenced in the previous slide actually mentioned some key business priorities which really align well with the overall goals and outcomes of DevOps. So it's no surprise that DevOps adoption across the tech sector is increasing. Companies need to accelerate business activities. They need to lower cost, improve time to market, and bring about a positive change in processes and people. And this is the thing we always like to say here at Redgate when it comes to DevOps. When we define it, it's not just about what tools you're using. You could be using any tools, but effectively you need to have the right people and the right processes to underpin the use of that tool or tools. So we know that a lot of the principles of DevOps are built upon breaking down silos, reducing tension between dev and ops and various teams within the organization. Now, in 2019, Redgate have this brand shiny new report, the State of Database DevOps report. And honestly, if you haven't read it yet, I would highly recommend you go and have a read because it is a cracking good read, a bit of bedtime reading there for all of us. But effectively, this was us going out to over 1,000 people and asking for their opinions on DevOps, how they're doing DevOps in their organization, what is blocking them, what sorts of things they've had to do in order to put these processes in place, and to get some feedback on where we think this is going. Now, this wasn't just Redgate customers, this was people in the community at large, and we got a pretty interesting idea back. In fact, one of the things that I like to call out on this particular slide is which of these would be the main driver for automating the delivery of database changes as part of a wider DevOps process. And you can see very well at the top there, 30% to increase speed of delivery of database changes. Now, we were already talking about speed, and speed effectively is helping us translate that into business value. And that's the main driver for people wanting to adopt this. Now, there are still some really interesting figures on here, such as to free up developers' time for more added value work. And I think that's worthwhile pointing out because there's nothing we hate more as a company than doing things over and over and over again, where manual error can creep in, where we potentially have to waste a lot of our time waiting or proofreading, checking, all of these sorts of things. It would be a lot easier if there was some kind of automated process as part of what we're doing, as part of our development work. And then the interesting one there at the bottom, to more easily meet audit or regulatory requirements. Now that's only 4%, but then we did ask for the main driver. So that's not to say that that wasn't people's kind of secondary or tertiary drivers, but it's really interesting that it's only sat there at 4% because I really feel as though a DevOps process can actually greatly enable people to achieve all of these things here on this slide. And we'll have a talk about that as we go through. So, like I said, there are many people who argue that adopting DevOps or adopting DevOps practices, working faster, delivering faster, having more people involved can actually increase the risk of errors and or data breaches. Now, I hope that if you're one of those people, we will have proven why this is absolutely not the case by the end of today's webinar. But I do want to spend a bit of time diving into this topic of data privacy and protection before we actually discuss the DevOps approaches you can take to support it. Now, a company's data, as we all know, is one of its most valuable and important resources. It's absolutely critical in driving business value, whether we're talking business intelligence, we're talking development and testing. It's the actual bulk of what we need to function as a business. So managing and protecting that data, they're both big responsibilities. And now more than ever, a data governance process just has to be put in place to avoid misuse and ultimately to meet requirements and regulations. So I came across this quote from Dr. Larry Ponemon, who is the chairman and founder of the Ponemon Institute, a research think tank dedicated to advancing privacy. Now, it's all about practices for them. They're kind of a data protection, information security practice central institute. And Dr. Ponemon is considered a pioneer in privacy auditing and the responsible information management framework. Now, Security Magazine named him as one of the most influential people for security, and I can see why. So data breaches and the implications associated continue to be an unfortunate reality for today's businesses. Year over year, we see the tremendous cost burden that organizations face following a data breach. Now, if you are an avid follower of us here at Redgate and of our webinars, then you'll know that last year I did a webinar on reducing your attack surface area. And in that particular webinar, we said that a data breach has this kind of twofold hit to a business. We have the kind of initial slam of losing the data and then the immediate fines, but then that irradiating effect as well of how much damage it can do to you as a company in terms of your reputation. And it's really important that we understand how critical looking after this data can be for a company. So it really brings home the detrimental impact of a data breach or leak and how long that can last. So data breaches, I've already mentioned them. They continue to plague every industry, and they put companies' assets and reputations at risk. Most recently, 2 additional data breaches have drawn the public eye. The first of those was in January this year and affected Rubrik, an IT security and cloud management company, fairly well known. I'd be surprised if many of you hadn't heard of them. And the database that was breached was running on a hosted Amazon Elasticsearch server, and it was storing tens of gigabytes of data, including customer names, contact information, casework for corporate customers, and that was dating back to October 2018. So Rubrik stated at the time, whilst building a new solution for customer support, a sandbox environment containing a subset of our customer corporate contact information, try saying that 3 times fast, and support interaction data was potentially accessible for a brief period of time. So Rubrik have resolved this issue, and they believe that no one did in fact access it whilst it was available. But it's really interesting that creating sandboxed environments isn't one of the immediate things we think of when we think data breach. We think someone breaking in, cracking production wide open like a walnut and then taking everything from inside. But no, actually this was a side environment being used for as a sandboxed environment. So it's really interesting to see that that was the thing at risk. So the second example was late January, early February, and that was the State Bank of India, the largest financial institution in that country of nearly 1.5 billion people. So they said it failed to secure a server with a password, leaving financial information for millions of customers exposed as a result of human error. Now, the database itself contains text messages, account balances, recent transactions, partial bank account numbers, customers' phone numbers. So that potentially has a huge impact on those millions of people, and not only leaves them open to potential hack attacks, but also just social engineering attacks. If you've got a few of these details, this is just enough for a hacker to actually make use of it. But where are these breaches coming from? How are they still happening? Well, it's pretty clear, regardless of which industry or sector you're in, they're going to come from somewhere. And there are so many sources that a breach can come from. As we just discussed about the State Bank of India, financial institutions are being hammered constantly from all sides as the data that can potentially result from a breach can pay hackers in dividends. Really, if attacks can come from anywhere at any time, then there's really only one approach that we can take, and governments and organizations around the world will be keeping a watchful eye on this as the privacy landscape of the world rapidly changes as 2019 storms ahead. So we can all agree we should be protecting our customer data, but that's for the good of the people who place their trust in us. But of course, we have other things to deal with. Privacy regulations around the world, such as HIPAA, SOX, GDPR, the California Consumer Privacy Act, the New York Shield, etc., etc., etc. I could go on for hours. They demand effective and repeatable processes for protecting sensitive data, or data privacy by design and by default. Now, this is a really important principle and something that I love saying so much that all of my colleagues here at Redgate are probably getting sick of me saying it. But actually, it's a line from the GDPR that is being picked up by a lot of these regulations around the world. It's forming the basis for so many other regulations to come into force. And really, it describes exactly how to meet the regulation. People say the GDPR is quite grey, it's hard to interpret, it's not like ISO 27001, which is just a tick box. But as long as we are protecting data by design and by default, will that be enough? I would argue yes, as long as you're taking appropriate steps. But what is the cost of non-compliance for just some of these regulations? Well, it's right before you. Fines, prison sentences can easily be levied for breaching these controls that we have in place to protect this information. There are so many pieces of legislation that can be enforced where personally identifiable, or PII, information, or personally protected health information, PHI, is concerned. Most notably, in the US, they have HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and SOX, or Sarbanes-Oxley, something that we at least have a full history to pull from. And by looking down this list in front of you, you'll see that there are many cases that highlight just how much of an impact they can have. So we've got a few up on the screen here. HIPAA and SOX, obviously US based. We're looking at fines, prison time, the GDPR, up to 4% of annual global turnover, or 20 million euros, whichever is larger, which again is mind-boggling for some large enterprises. For Poppy in South Africa, up to 10 million rand and 12 months in prison. Pipeda in Canada, up to $100,000. These aren't small numbers or small impacts. It has a massive, massive impact on the company. If we take just HIPAA, for instance, then, in June 2018, the Office for Civil Rights investigated the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center, or MD Anderson, following 3 separate data breach reports in 2012 and 2013 involving the theft of an unencrypted laptop from the residence of an MD Anderson employee, and the loss of 2 unencrypted USB drives containing the unencrypted electronic protected health information of over 33,500 individuals. And that landed them with a total fine of $4.348 million, which sounds like a lottery win, but it's quite the opposite. It's a painful amount to be fined. Now, from an attack surface perspective, OCR's investigation found that MD Anderson had written encryption policies going as far back as 2006, and that MD Anderson's own risk analyses had found the lack of device-level encryption posed a high risk to the security of EPHI. But despite these encryption policies and high-risk findings, MD Anderson did not even begin to adopt an enterprise-wide solution to implement the encryption of this information until 2011. And even then, it failed to encrypt its inventory of electronic devices containing that information between March 24th, 2011 and January 25th, 2013. That's nearly 2 years. So whilst they had an understanding of what the size of the headache was and what was required of them, they continued to create additional assets and associated vulnerabilities. And now ultimately they have to pay the piper, as it were, for not taking appropriate precautions, for not protecting data by design and by default. So with this in mind, we're working with leading organizations to extend DevOps practices to the database and address the need for increased releases by standardizing team-based development, automating deployments, etc., whilst also ensuring that your personal identifiable information stays secure by monitoring performance and availability, protecting and preserving data. So while 89% of the organizations we asked in Redgate's State of Database DevOps report are already adopting or plan to adopt DevOps in the next couple of years, the database has traditionally, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, been a bottleneck. So this is because databases carry state and business critical data that needs to be safely preserved. For most organizations, database change management often involves a lot of manual steps. A developer manually saves off the script for their changes. Maybe they put them in source control. Maybe they put them in some folder somewhere. Later, it gets submitted to a DBA or DBA team or an ops team through some kind of ticketing system or other means for review, and then gets executed against higher environments that may or may not closely resemble production. Ultimately, though, deployments of databases are not as easy as swapping out old code with new. And this is our fundamental problem. We can't simply swap out a table because we don't like it, especially as databases hold this business critical data that needs to be safely preserved. And because of the unique challenges with database delivery, this means that often we find the database is left out of the process. We have the conversation. Oh, what are you doing for source control, continuous integration, release management, etc.? Oh yeah, we're doing all of that. That's absolutely fine. Oh, even for the database. Oh no, not that. And we hear it so often purely because they're two very different challenges. So this is what compliant database DevOps looks like. And this is what Redgate would say it looks like. I like a nice diagram. I'm sure you'll like a nice diagram as much as I do. And effectively what we can see here is we have on the lower left-hand side, we have those developers all working hard, delivering wonderful business value to their databases, whether they're working in a shared model or everyone has their own sandboxed environment, for instance. Link those to source control, be able to script out the changes we are making to those databases, and then have it kick off a continuous integration process, something that documents, that builds, that tests, potentially populates it with additional data. All of these additional steps that go some way to verifying that ultimately our changes are going to work once they move up to other environments. Now, of course, once we've done that to build process, we have a nice, neat little package. And what we can do is then just push that up to testing, QA, staging, and ultimately production. And again, it's down to process. It's down to being able to have this whole thing as fluid as possible to ensure that constant delivery of value. Then, of course, we have the monitoring and optimizing. And everyone says, well, Chris, how does monitoring my SQL Server environment fit into a DevOps practice? That's more of a problem for our ops people. And I say, well, actually, it's kind of threefold. The first is that if we don't have access to our own servers, say for instance something happens which leave them unavailable or in a state we're not sure of, and the first thing we hear about it is our users are saying, oh, I can't access the database or something's gone wrong, and then we're clearly not reacting with the right level of urgency that that process deserves. We should be able to spot problems the second that they happen and then fix them if indeed they need fixing. Then, of course, the second being, how do we proactively tune things? If we can proactively tune our servers, then we're also still taking part in that process, that pipeline of delivering value to end users. If somebody writes some queries, some stored procedures, and then checks that in, builds it, releases it, that's all great. But what if they then cause slowdown on the target environment? How do we spot that easy? How do we go back and refresh that? It's all collaboration, communication, being able to optimize that proactively, feed that back into dev, and then feed it back up through our pipeline. And then, of course, spotting odd behavior. It's as simple as that. Being able to see, well, hey, my SQL server's behaving a bit odd. Okay, well, let's have a look. I fear that we may be subject to a SQL injection. Okay, well, we can now take steps to mitigate that. So that's both in terms of compliance, actually helping to protect our environments, but also helping to deliver value to end users. It really kind of straddles the two. Now, the next step is backups. Actually simply making sure we are taking backups and that we are retaining data for only as long as it is useful. We're making sure we encrypt those backups to a really high standard, maybe 256-bit AES, something that is sensible and something that can be implemented quickly. Now, also defining retention periods for that data, not having backups sat around on a network share for ages and ages where someone can very, very easily come in and take those backups. It needs to be part of the process. So ensuring that we're taking those fulls, those differentials, those logs, but only holding on to them as long as we need. And then, of course, when it comes to coming back along the pipeline, on an application side, it's fair enough to have this source control, CI, release management process in place that's constantly ticking away and pushing value up the pipeline. But with databases, pre-production environments go pretty stale pretty quickly. And what we need is some way of ensuring that dev and test and QA, all of those good pre-production environments are spun up, refreshed, kept up to date in such a way they resemble production, because we want to know that our changes that we're making to dev will affect production in the desired way, but also in the sense that we want to make sure that each of our developers has all they need to deliver that value. Of course, we don't want to be caught out like Rubrik were and create an environment that's full of sensitive data, though. So we also need a way of creating these environments that somehow protects the data. Do we use encryption? Well, if the encryption key's on the database and that all gets taken, then potentially not. So we might need to look at other methods like masking data instead, statically changing the underlying data in the database. That's absolutely a process that not only would protect customer data, but allow us to retain the look and feel of production, and also give the developers and testers everything they need to develop and test. And then the whole thing is cyclical. It continues. So create a new environment or new environments from our source, our backup, our production environment, which have been protected. Developers link that to source control, make a load of changes, deliver that value, kick it off a continuous integration build it, document it, test it, and then release it at the speed of innovation. Now, because this is all process oriented, it does allow us to have the right people and the right processes in place. And then, of course, that is when we can start looking at things like tooling. So there are kind of 4 key elements to compliant database DevOps from Redgate's beliefs, and that is, of course, to standardize, automate, monitor, and protect. And we'll take a brief look at those 4 stages and how they can help. So with IT teams under pressure to deliver software more quickly, it's a challenge to ensure the consistency and quality of code during database development. Even more so for large teams of application and database developers with different ways of working, or geographically distributed teams in different locations and time zones, even something as simple as just the way we write code. I used to work with a coworker who wrote all of her T-SQL on 1 line. Now, for me, that was mind-boggling. For her, that was perfectly normal, but it did mean there was a disconnect in how we were working. So the first step of compliant database DevOps is actually standardizing that team-based development. By adopting best practices like standardized coding, code analysis, database version control, your developers save time. They avoid tedious rework and are free to deliver on value-added work. I should also point out version control is the foundation to a successful DevOps pipeline, and therefore it is becoming standard in both application development and database development, and it involves developers checking those changes into a common repository during the development process, preferably at the end of each working day or as they're making the changes, entirely up to process, of course. And as a direct result, everyone has access to the latest version of the application or the database. And it's always clear what was changed, when it was changed, who changed it. You have that audit trail. And this is just as true for database code as on the application side. It can also be version controlled, preferably by integrating with and plugging into the same version control system used for your application, whether you're using TFS, whether you're using Git within TFS, or Azure DevOps, however Microsoft want to call it. Any kind of source control system, if there's people still using Subversion, that's fine too. But effectively, we want to make sure that there is parity, harmony between that application and database development. So without a proper source control strategy, you shouldn't even consider looking at implementing continuous integration and deployment or delivery. So in Redgate's State of Database DevOps report, we did also ask people what practices were in place for the application versus the database. You'll notice in the graph on the screen that 83% had version control in place for the application, but only 55% had the same in place for the database. Now, where is that disparity coming from? Why is there no harmony between these two things? Because the application and the database aren't the same, but the principles are the same. So really, we should be looking at how to kick off that version control process to then lead us into things like continuous integration and automated deployments. So it really is down to that team-based development and actually being able to get everyone to work together, actually being able to understand what they're doing, understand what people are doing together, and that's what's going to help them really derive that value. So the next step is, of course, automating database deployments. So without the right processes or tooling in place, database change management does slow things down, adding risk, uncertainty, and blocking development and operations from working together to deliver that value. For example, it's very common practice for database shops to cherry pick changes and scripts from development and promote them up the chain, which results in a deployment process being inconsistent, unreliable, time consuming, and, in my opinion, risky. And that's what we want to avoid here. That's the kind of key driver for everyone around us, is the word risk. Wherever risk is associated, people look at it very closely and tend to need a better process in place. Ideally, every time a change is committed to version control, for example, a continuous integration process can be triggered, which then tests the change and flags up any errors in the code. That can include identifying broken dependencies, running static code analysis, unit tests, and that detects bad coding practices. By doing this continuously as part of that development process, the errors can be fixed immediately and tested again before the change is then passed along to the release management tool of choice, where the change can be reviewed before it is deployed to production. So by adopting the right source controlling strategy, database continuous integration and continuous delivery, and shift left testing. Now that's an important one that I'll just pull aside for a second. So Microsoft are very keen on this shift left mentality, and indeed Redgate has a fantastic magazine called Shift Left, which I very much recommend you go and have a read of as well. There's some fantastic articles in there. Now what shift left means is actually shifting everything left, catching it earlier in the development cycle, having a rigorous and reliable testing process where you're able to catch bugs sooner and ensure that it's only the good stuff getting through to production. So by doing this, your development and operations teams can synchronize database and application delivery, and indeed synchronize the way they work, communicate better, and collaborate on the effective delivery of this value. Ultimately, your organization can resolve issues earlier and faster, deploy as quickly and frequently as the business needs, and optimize agility and performance across the full software lifecycle. So let's look back quickly at the previous graphs I showed you earlier. So again, you'll notice that here, continuous integration, 53% for application code, but only half of that for the database. Test automation, more than double for the application than for the database. For most of us, unit testing is a no-brainer for application code, but for databases, again, it's close to non-existent. If these figures look familiar and represent what's going on in your organization, you'll likely want to address it if you're going to improve the quality and speed of delivery of your software. So next, we look at monitoring. Once upon a time, a data breach was considered to be an event when a third party had gained unauthorized access to held data. However, with the introduction of rules around the right to be forgotten, we now have to add to the fact that an event when you lose access to your own data could also be considered a breach, and the predefined response should be followed. Again, it's all process oriented. So both the situations rely on our ability to have real-time information on the state and activities of our database environments, or more specifically, database monitoring. As estates grow in size and complexity, the process of manually monitoring them becomes increasingly difficult. Manual checks, well, they're time-consuming, they're reactive, you might not be the first one to know about them. The DBAs and ops people find themselves constantly in firefighting mode, and ask yourself this question: how many times have you been fighting a fire or told someone that you're too busy firefighting? So it's easy to miss crucial elements that can put your organization at risk of security breaches or poor performance. And that leaves you without historical context for proactive data management as well. So with proactive estate monitoring and accurate reporting, your teams can easily detect, diagnose, and resolve those performance problems before they impact your operations or customers. By being on top of the health and status of your estate, you ensure minimum downtime and efficient disaster recovery. So with increasing data protection legislation like the GDPR and HIPAA, it's no surprise that security and protection is actually at the top of our list. But almost 50% of our respondents in our State of SQL monitoring survey are already deploying changes multiple times a week and almost no one expected the frequency of those deployments to decrease. So whatever challenges you and your SQL servers face over the next year, consider including monitoring as part of that solution, as part of that pipeline, because it can only make your life easier. So 50% of people said security is a key daily responsibility. Obviously GDPR for our kind of European-based, but also wider audiences who deal with European data, that ranks highest on the list of security and protection challenges. But interestingly, the majority of people are still firefighting rather than proactive monitoring. With the right monitoring tool in place, for example, you can catch deployment errors, diagnose issues faster, and prevent them from recurring. That allows you to track and plan your growing estate and catch unexpected or even unauthorized access to your servers. Tying everything together, monitoring gives us this ability to manage the estate, to monitor for any issues, and also ultimately to protect the information which exists in our most crucial location, production. Now, an ever so slight aside, but if you feel like winning $250 or the equivalent in your currency, wherever you're based, Amazon voucher, then you can very easily put your name in with a shout to do so. If you go to www.redgate.com/monitoring survey, as is up on the screen at the moment, then you can be in with a chance to win a $250 or equivalent Amazon voucher, and that will actually help inform us as to how you're monitoring your SQL servers at the moment and what sorts of things we're dealing with moving forward, what people are concerned with, and how you're working. And then, of course, you can read that report afterwards and see roughly where you fit within the wider scope of people. So, aside over, let's jump back in. Now, the final step to achieving that compliant database DevOps that we've been talking about is protecting sensitive data as it moves through database environments. So kind of similar to what we heard previously about the issues Rubrik had, we want to make sure that our sandboxed or pre-production environments are safe. So as data protection legislation becomes more stringent and as the risk of data breaches rise, so does scrutiny of how sensitive data is stored and used within organizations. And we can no longer defend the processing of sensitive information in our pre-production environments. At the same time, development teams are facing growing pressure to release software faster and avoid the database being a bottleneck. So organizations have to find a way to safeguard against data breaches and unauthorized access, whilst also giving the team access to reliable data for development and testing without risking exposure of sensitive or personally identifiable information. So it's kind of a balancing act. The DBAs or whoever's in charge of operations are kind of juggling multiple balls and trying to appease everyone. And what we need is a kind of repeatable, reliable process that then sets all of this up for us. But why is that? Well, in recent research we conducted, we wanted to identify how organizations currently create or refresh their pre-production databases, and to assess the importance of this provisioning requirement to ensure adherence to these emerging data protection obligations. So we gathered responses from nearly 500 data professionals for this one. That was from a wide range of job roles and a variety of industries. So you can see one of the findings on the screen now. Software teams want to use production data. That's not any surprise to me. I'm sure it's not to you, but it's more predictable. It's more reliable. It's just not compliant. So given this need for production data, this next stat may not come as a surprise, but the numbers are quite shocking. 72% of people use a direct copy of production in their development, test, and QA environments. I'm just going to leave you with that for a second. 72%. Now, as a person who buys things online and inevitably has their data in various companies, organizations across the world, I'm pretty sure that my details exist in development, in test, in QA for some of these organizations. And to me, the thought is, what if there is a data breach? What happens? How do they deal with that? What process do they have in place? So interestingly, those who were restricted from using prod data was mainly due to sensitivity and regulatory requirements. But with increasing regulation, organizations are having to take more caution with how that data is used and who has access to it. One solution, of course, is to have a version of the production database with a limited data set of just anonymized data, which is always used to develop and test against. This, of course, means that changes are tested against a database that is neither realistic nor a size where the impact on performance can be assessed or a realistic data set can be fetched back. So it's, yeah, again, it's not ideal. Another solution would, of course, be to take a copy of the production database and mask the data manually by replacing columns with similar but generic data. And this copy can then be used in development and testing, but again, will age very quickly as ongoing changes are deployed to the production database. And this is where data masking measures like pseudonymization, encryption, anonymization, and aggregation should be adopted. So Redgate does offer a solution in this space. I would be a fool if I didn't mention it, something called SQL Provision, which introduces the equivalent of a data firewall. So we provide a way of getting production-like data to developers and testers, people who categorically don't need access to production data. And of course, this mitigates many of the factors that meant in the past we weren't able to do this. Ultimately, we're able to ensure that anything we do in pre-production is heavily tested to make sure it will work when promoted, but ensures that we're doing the very thing we should be doing from the start. And I'm sure you're, again, going to be sick of me saying this, but it's protecting data by design and by default. So however you're doing this, whether you're using Redgate SQL Provision or you're doing some backup and restore process, anything like that, it's still about protecting the data and ensuring that only the necessary people have access to sensitive information. Now, for those who aren't familiar with Redgate SQL Provision, the way this works is by creating a single centralized virtualized image of your originating database, spinning up localized differencing disks onto instances that reference back to that image. Now, as the image is created, it is entirely masked, i.e. all of the sensitive data on there is anonymized, but you can retain a bunch of that useful, interesting data. So names, last names, emails, gone, but realistic, bank balances, and so those are left for potentially good quality testing and development. And then, of course, these instances can be worked on, these copies, these clones can be worked on, delivered to developer copies, a dev test server, wherever you need them. And effectively, everyone gets their own sandbox copy. Now, the good thing is, SQL Provision doesn't need the full data. We don't need a terabyte everywhere we're going to exist it. In fact, each of the clones that we're spinning up for dev, for test, for QA, those are effectively only 50 megabytes or so. So that means we have only one sensitive copy of the data which exists in production. That's where it should stay, absolutely. But then for dev, test, QA, they get a full set of information, but it has been anonymized. So if anyone gets their hands on any of these clones, it is useless to them. When there are fewer assets for us to worry about, even if there are vulnerabilities that can be exploited to gain access to the data in pre-production, because we've anonymized it, there's a much smaller risk. And there's that word again, risk, to our customers. So we're minimizing risk wherever we can. So this is alongside the added benefits to us as a company that we can quickly spin up low footprint, easy to use clones, whether this is for dedicated sandbox development or agile testing, spinning up parallel testing environments, or a staging environment as a pre-deployment step before production. It's entirely up to you, but effectively SQL Provision enables compliant database DevOps at each stage of the pipeline and then lets us move value up to production more quickly. So just to summarize then, that's compliant database DevOps, standardizing team-based development, ensuring that people are moving in the same direction at the same speed in the same way, automating what we can, ensuring that there's no manual involvement required for generating these scripts and moving them around and selectively building them, deploying them, etc. It should all be repeatable, reliable, and robust. We should then also be monitoring the whole process for reacting appropriately, for proactively monitoring, and of course then we should be protecting and preserving our data wherever we put it, creating that wonderful compliant database DevOps ecosystem, delivering value over the top through build to deployment up to production quickly, delivering at the speed of innovation, and then of course pulling value back to the rest of the team, not slowing down at any stage. If you're interested in reading a bit more about how something like a compliant database DevOps process can help you as a company, then there is a fantastic case study available. So wholly owned by Sweden's labour market parties. I'm going to butcher this. My Swedish, unfortunately, is terrible. But AFA Försäkring, or AFA Insurance, they provide a range of insurance policies, financial support to over 4 million employees in both the public and private sector. So covering incapacity for work due to sickness, work injury, shortage of work, death, parental leave, all of these sorts of reasons. It manages assets of approximately 24 billion US dollars. So behind the scenes for them, 5 development teams manage around 70 servers and around 400 databases just on the Microsoft platform. Now they look after 2 online systems which handle 130,000 logins per week. So the team at AFA started working with Redgate tools originally to resolve conflicts between development, testing, pre-production and production environments. Manually scripting out objects was very slow and inefficient, and some were invariably missed, which caused downtime during deployments. So you can read a bit more about how the SQL Toolbelt from Redgate and also our SQL Provision technology helped them transform their development procedures. So I think we've got just a bit of time for some questions. I'm going to pull out the little question box and see if we've had any today. There we are. It appears we don't. Oh no, one has come in. Fantastic. Okay, so how do we ensure that the data that we're provisioning into pre-production, how do we ensure that that stays fresh if we're creating a one-off image? Well, the answer to that is, of course, that the whole process is PowerShell enabled. So if you need to automate the process of spinning up pre-production environments, then you can very easily do so overnight, at the end of the day, over the weekend, whenever you need to, you can very easily spin those up. So nice and fresh, freshly masked data, but the point is it is up to date. Another question, how does it compare with Delphix? Now, that's an interesting question. We're not really in the business of kind of doing comparisons with other companies, particularly from a Redgate side, because we really believe that the tools and solutions that we're developing really deliver value. So effectively, we would say that the good thing about SQL Provision is that it will fit into 99.9% of Microsoft ecosystems. It has been architected from the ground up to just fit in seamlessly with whatever you're using at the time. And it's very much white box technology. So we're enabling you to speed up your processes, but still have that kind of auditable side of things. And of course, because it's leveraging Microsoft technologies, it's just using things that you already have in the company. One more question. Can I replay the session? Yes, absolutely. You will get a lovely email from us here at Redgate with a link to this recording, so you can replay it and listen to my wonderful dulcet tones as often as you like. There's another question. Any demo, is there any demo video of database automated deployments through the tool? I would say there's two kind of answers to that. One is please do go to our Redgate hub. The Redgate hub is a fantastic place to be for learning that will help you and show you some of the capabilities of how Redgate would implement that. And of course, get in touch with us. If you're interested in seeing more, just contact us here at Redgate and we will happily talk to you about it, show you it, etc. And one more question, I think that's all that we've got time for, is what are its implications on Microsoft licensing? That's kind of more of I would say an offline question. It doesn't really have any impact on MS licensing. So yeah, we can absolutely have a chat with you. Please do feel free to reach out. We'll talk to you about that. Not a problem. And then, okay, one final one that's very straightforward. Can I use Redgate tools with TFS? Yes, absolutely. All of the Redgate tools, the SQL tool belt can link to TFS for source controlling, build and deployment. There are plugins available on the TFS marketplace, and with provision as well. There's also a provision plugin, and also you can use the whole PowerShell enabled side of things for both provision and the tool belt for build, release, and the cloning of masked environments. So that's all TFS enabled as well. We're very much built into that Microsoft stack with these tools as well. So one final thing just from me then before we finish off. I did want to point out that we have the SQL in the City Summit and SQL in the City streamed events coming up. You'll hear from industry experts as they discuss their challenges of DevOps adoption, share their experiences of how to successfully implement database DevOps across an IT team. The sessions are primarily for C-level executives, directors, managers, senior database professionals, architects, engineers, anyone who works with that Microsoft data platform. So feel free to check out these two, well, I say these two, they're pretty much the same website, the hub/events website, because you'll be able to use the code webinar, that's WEBINAR, to get yourself a complimentary ticket to any of these events. In fact, we've got 3 exclusive SQL in the City summits in New York, London, and Chicago. We've also got a few others up here as well. So in Austin and LA, those are all on the website. Go and feel free to sign up and we'll happily walk you through what we see as compliant database DevOps. For now, thank you very much for your time. Please do feel free to check out red-gate.com. As I said, the hub is a fantastic source of information. Redgate University, all of the product learning articles, Simple Talk, SQL Server Central, all of these wonderful resources from Redgate. And of course, feel free to get in touch with us. Feel free to listen to DBAL and add me on LinkedIn. I'm no stranger to accepting a request, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of the week.